Well, hello, and very warm welcome to this Maundy Thursday reflection. This is the moment in the Holy Week when we relive the night before the crucifixion. Jesus had just left the Last Supper with the disciples, and some of them had made their way to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is just at the foot of the Mount of Olives. I did slightly wonder if I could create the Mount of Olives in my garden, but we only have one olive tree, and it lives in a big tub. And it's actually a bit too cold for it to come out from its winter quarters yet. So anyway, at least I'm in the garden anyway. And Jesus went there with a particular motive, which was to pray. And most of what we'll do in these next few minutes is to look at exactly what he prayed. But when he'd finished praying, he went back to the disciples and he found them fast asleep. And he said to them, "Couldn't you just watch even for an hour?" And he said to Peter, "I want you to watch and pray." And sometimes, therefore, the vigil that people hold on Maundy Thursday is called a watch service, exactly for that reason. Well, John devotes a whole chapter to recalling this prayer in remarkable detail. So I'm going to suggest that what we do is we'll read it in three little bits. I'm going to suggest that you press pause at each moment, and then we'll reflect on what it is Jesus has prayed in each of those three fairly short sections. So let's start. It all happens in John chapter 17, and the beginning of it is when he prays for himself in verses 1 to 5. So do press pause, read the passage, and let's begin again in a moment, and we'll think about what it was he was praying. Well, interestingly, this is the bit where Jesus prays for himself. And I'm sure, like me, you have a prayer list. You might not write it down, but there'll be people you pray for regularly, and you'll gradually change that list, and people will come onto it. But I bet one of the names that probably isn't on your list is your own. For some reason, most of us find it much harder to pray for ourselves than we do for other people. I remember at the beginning of this slightly difficult chapter we're in right now, the bishop sent a little video to all the clergy, and in it he drew inspiration from Acts 20, where it says that we should watch over ourselves. And actually that's exactly right. If we don't watch over ourselves, we're probably not going to be an awful lot of use to anybody else. So actually, although we may have a reluctance to praying for ourselves, actually that's what Jesus models for us. People sometimes ask me, what would you like prayer for? And when I share, I know that they'll go away and pray those things. But actually I wonder if I always pray the same things myself, because actually I'm not sure I always do. So I think the first little thought I want to take away from this is that Jesus thought it was important enough to start his prayer by praying for himself. And actually, as we think about the chapter ahead of us and we need to watch over ourselves, perhaps we might just take that as a message that we can pray not just for other people, but actually in there we can pray too for ourselves. Well, let's look at the second part of this prayer. This is going to be John 17 again, verses 6 to 19. And this is where he prays specifically for the disciples. So press pause again and read the passage, and let's come back and reflect on that. Well, this is the start of what today we would call a prayer of intercession. He's praying for other people. But at the moment, he's focused purely and singularly on his disciples, on his immediate followers, recognizing that actually in a very short space of time, he won't be there in terms of earthly presence, but they will. And they will face all of the reality and challenges that are going to come about to them. And he's praying for them to be in the world, but somehow not changed or modified or even corrupted by the world. We sometimes use that expression, don't we, in the world, but not of the world. And so it's a prayer of protection, that they will be protected from all of those difficult forces of evil, but at the same time it's a prayer of commissioning. He's commissioning them to go out and do the work that he's sending them to. Well, in a sense, that's why this is the day when normally I and my ministry colleagues and the readers, all of us would be in the cathedral. and we'd be reaffirming our promises as ministers, reaffirming our vows, if you like. And the bishop would start the words with words like this. He'd say, I invite you now to dedicate yourselves afresh to his service as stewards of the mysteries of God and ministers of his grace. Well, we don't have to be ordained or readers or whatever to be ministers of his grace. We can all do that. So, and I think the times are coming when we're going to need to be, all of us, ministers of God's grace. And this is a great moment, therefore, as we approach whatever the new normal is going to be in the weeks and months ahead, that we reaffirm ourselves to God's service, that God will use us in those weeks and months ahead. So that's my second thought for the short reflection, is actually this is a moment to recommit ourselves to God's service in anticipation of what may be ahead. Well, let's now look at the third part of this prayer. This is, again, John 17, starting at verse 20 and going through to the end to verse 26. And this is where he prays for all believers. So I'll pause again. Well, as Jesus prays for all believers, it isn't just for those people at that time. It's actually for all people, for all time. In other words, he's praying for you and for me. And the distinctive and unique thing about our Christian faith is that it's all about a relationship with Jesus. And here he is spelling it out exactly in those terms. His prayer for all those believers is that they will have that relationship with him. As he prays to the Father, he says this, I in them and you in me. In other words, the Father lives in Jesus and Jesus lives in the hearts of the believers. Well, as well as this being the day for the Chrism service in the cathedral for all ministers, it's also the day when Her Majesty the Queen presents Maundy money at various cathedrals around the country to people who are typically retired, and they're being recognised for their Christian service. And it's a day that's become, I suppose, quite resonant and special in our family. Back in 1979, Penny's grandmother was one of the people who was blessed to receive Maundy money at Winchester Cathedral, and it rather brought it into our awareness. And then just 3 years ago, my sister Hilary similarly received Maundy money at Leicester Cathedral. So it's become, in that sense, a bit of a special moment, a resonant moment for us as a family. Well, the name Maundy derives from the Latin word for commandment. And the command that Jesus gave that's being remembered here was what he said at the Last Supper, which is that he wanted his disciples and his followers and the believers to love one another. And in that royal Maundy service that the Queen attends, there's a Maundy prayer. And in the Maundy prayer it reminds us that Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, teaching us by example the grace of humility, that loving one another. We're called, of course, to reflect God's love into the lives of those around us. So if I draw those three threads together, what we're being asked to do, I think, here, first of all, is to remember to watch over ourselves, to pray for ourselves, particularly, I think, at this moment. Secondly, then, to recommit ourselves to God's service, that we will be, going forward, ministers of his grace, out of that expression. And then thirdly, of course, that we will hold on to that commandment. It wasn't a request, it really was a command to love one another, to reflect God's love into the lives of other people. And I know there's an awful lot of that going on right now, and what an amazing blessing it is to our community. So, we always know the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, as just that. We call it the Lord's Prayer. Actually, that was the prayer that he gave to us. In a sense, it's our prayer. And some would argue that the Lord's Prayer is the one we've just been reading. This is the one that he himself prayed. So let's hold on to that prayer and think about it, particularly as we enter this challenging chapter ahead of us. I think it will equip us well to do God's work. So God's blessings upon you as we move from Maundy Thursday into Good Friday.